Hi, I'm Peter Shergold and I'm the Macquarie Group Foundation Professor at the Centre for Social Impact, or as we like to call it, CSI. Now, CSI is a collaboration between 4 university business schools in Australia: New South Wales, Melbourne, Swinburne and Western Australia. And we work in the area of not-for-profit management and leadership, corporate social responsibility and sustainability, philanthropy and social investment, and that whole area of social entrepreneurship, social enterprise and social innovation. And I am delighted today to welcome to Australia a very eminent person, Jon Huggett, who has a long background in the corporate sector, but then worked for a long time for Bridgespan Consulting and is now taking on a role going around in a number of countries talking about what opportunities there are in the social economy. So Jon, welcome.
Thank you, Peter.
Now Jon, this is really interesting. I've looked at your CV. In many ways you look like a normal visitor to a business school, long management and then leadership history. You've been a president of a company, you've been a CEO of a company, and a whole range of things from contact lenses through to the internet, through to consulting. A very straight business record, if I may say so. And yet here you are now with a different interest in social enterprise. So how did you tread that path?
Well, Peter, it's a number of different things. First of all, I've always had an interest in the sector. I volunteered as a kid. For a long time when I was running a company, I volunteered in my spare time doing street work as an outreach volunteer through to serving on a board of a non-profit I was proud of. But over time, I've become more engaged in the sector, partly because I get more excited by the impact I can have, but because the sector right now really is moving into new areas for new impact.
Yeah.
There's not been this level of interest in the sector from people, from governments, or from business for a long time, and I'm very excited by the contribution it can make to the world over the next few years.
I agree.
Yeah.
So what is this creature, Bridgespan Consulting, that you now work for?
Well, Bridgespan is an organisation that is a non-profit that is there to help other non-profits.
So it's there to provide consultancy service to the non-profit sector.
That's right. Well, I worked with Bridgespan until January. I left there in
Yeah.
January to do more global work.
Yeah.
So Bridgespan does very, very good work in the United States. It's really 3 different services. Number one is it provides a lot of advisory work, consulting if you
Yeah.
like, to help people make good decisions. And that's philanthropists and non-profits. Secondly, what it does is it actually provides executive search. It helps people find the right leadership for the sector, but also it helps people who want to find good jobs in the sector find the right opportunities.
Yeah.
And then third, what it does is it shares what it learns. It's an open source model. So whereas many consultancies that we are aware of in the private sector, or ones that I've worked with, I've known well, tend to be very proprietary. Companies hire them because they want to get a competitive advantage, therefore they want to keep it quiet. Bridgespan has been open source. It shares what it learns.
Yeah.
So it publishes a lot of material so that the impact can get out to share with many different organisations around the sector.
So it really can help to drive organisational capacity and leadership in a range of not-for-profit organisations.
Absolutely.
Now, one of the interesting things is, of course, that both the corporate sector and government seem to be becoming much more interested in social enterprises. Am I right?
Absolutely. I think both sectors are seeing a lot of potential for new value. So in the corporate sector, you're seeing a real interest in engaging with customers in new ways, engaging with investors in new ways, and actually a new, more holistic view of shareholder value. So concrete example number one might be Walmart, which now collaborates with Conservation International.
Right.
You wouldn't have thought that 5 years ago, but it's a very happy alliance. Starbucks and Oxfam, you might think, could be at odds, and in fact they were. They had a pretty nasty fight in public over fair trade, but now they've actually come together with a common viewpoint and are working together, which is actually both helping farmers in Ethiopia and other poor countries and Starbucks business.
It just seems so different. In the past, you might have expected that a not-for-profit organisation would go to a company and say, you know, would you donate to us? Would you give us support? Would you give us $500,000 to do good things? It seems to me, from what you're saying, it's becoming a genuine partnership relationship. It seems to be emerging.
That's right. Because in many ways, the 2 sectors actually have shared interests. For example, if you look at the area of HIV drugs, if you went back to the early 80s, the activists and the pharmaceutical sector were very much at odds. There were demonstrations and so on. But it became pretty clear quickly that in fact both sectors had a huge set of interests in common. And one of the major problems they had was that the government was taking too long to approve new medicines. So this unlikely combination got together and made huge changes to the government. So it went to the government, asked for major changes, which the government accepted and speeded up the application process for new medicines, which has resulted in saving lots and lots of lives.
Well, you brought in the third area there as government,
Right.
because we now tend to talk about the private sector, the public service and government. And in fact, the area we're talking about increasingly called the third sector.
Yeah.
Now, let's go back to government. Government also seems to be becoming much more interested in ideas of social innovation and social enterprise.
Absolutely. Governments around the world are interested in the sector for the innovation it can bring, especially in the personalisation of public services. If we go back some time, we had public services that were like industrial era services, one size fits all. But whereas 25 years ago we all had the same telephone, but now we have individual phones, people want the same degree of personalisation from their public services too, and the third sector can provide it. So let me give you some examples. In education, in places from Sweden, which is often regarded as left-wing, through to Texas, which is often seen as right-wing, there's been
Bush territory.
Bush territory, exactly. There's been real innovation in schools, public schools that are run by non-profits. So in Sweden they're called free schools, in Texas they're called charter schools. But the idea is the same. You allow a little charity or a non-profit to put together a school in the neighbourhood that can then ask parents if they wish to send their kids there, and then the state pays for the cost of those kids up to the same level as it would do in a state-funded, regularly run school. And what these schools have managed to do is to come up with super results. Parents like them, they're often different, tailored to the kids, and sometimes they're just plain good.
It's a real social innovation.
Yeah.
And in a curious way, what it's doing, of course, it's giving school principals and parents much greater control over what they want from the public dollars that are spent on their education.
That's right. So to give you a concrete example, in Texas I worked with a chain of charter schools called Harmony. And what they have managed to do is to provide excellent education in science and math to kids that are, for the most part, poor and minority kids. So most of their kids are poor, most of their families qualify for free school meals, most of their kids are black and Hispanic. And yet they're consistently in the top 10% of Texas schools according to exam results. The first time I went there I was very impressed by the leader, a guy called Sona Taram, who proudly held up for me the trophy, which was the state chess championship. And he said that we were the only public school to reach the finals. By the time we got to the finals, all the other schools were private schools. So we were the only team in the finals with black kids and with Hispanic kids. He said, and we won it. What's exciting about what they do is they really try to get the relationship between parents and the school back again. That's why they're called Harmony.
Yep.
So they really try to get the parents involved in the school in ways that public schools often don't.
Yep.
It's a minor issue. They insist that parents, when they pick their kids up from school, don't just drive by and ask the kids to run out.
Yep.
They want the parents to come in, if only just for 2 seconds, to say, how did things go today with little Johnny?
Yep.
If you look to Sweden, there's been a whole variety of ways that schools teach.
Yeah.
So many of the new free schools use technology in ways that haven't been done before. Yeah. And for some kids, that works really, really well.
So this is actually the not-for-profit sector and the corporate sector working with parents and just facilitated, in a sense, by government.
That's right.
It's a new approach to citizen engagement. I think it's exciting.
That's right.
Now, if I look at the UK, I know there's, I think, an office of the third sector that's
right.
established in Prime Minister's department, or the Cabinet Office, as it's called in the UK. And I think the President Obama in the White House has set up an Office of Social Innovation.
That's right.
So there's obviously a lot going on now.
Absolutely. And in both countries, there's a fair bit of interest in where can we extend public innovation to the third sector? Where can we ask the sector to bring in more ideas? So things like rehabilitation for prisoners is coming in. Thinking of new ways to invest capital in the sector.
It's really interesting. I'm Peter Shergold, and I'm interviewing our visitor from the United States, Jon Huggett, on a whole series of issues about social innovation. Now, we've been talking very positively, Jon, but presumably this is quite challenging also, that many of the traditional charities, if you will, are now becoming commercial not-for-profits, even social enterprises.
That's right.
Presumably it's not an easy transition to make.
It's a lot of hard work. Right now, for a start, we have a global financial crisis, as everyone knows, which makes it hard to raise revenue and raise capital in particular. But frankly, it's always hard for the sector to raise money.
Yeah.
And so I think there's three key things that the sector can do to move forward, but these are major challenges.
Yeah.
The first thing is to focus on management, not just leadership.
Yeah.
There's a huge amount of excitement in the
Yeah.
sector on leadership, which is great. There's
Yeah.
social enterprise conferences and awards.
Yeah, I know when I was in the public service the last 10 years, every
Yeah.
course was on leadership.
That's
And
right.
eventually I thought, hang on a moment, it might be good to focus back on some of the management issues.
That's right.
Yeah.
Many people define leadership as setting a vision and being inspirational, and that's great. But management really is providing a decision-making service. It's looking at the folks in the field that are doing the hard work and saying, how can we as management help them by making decisions that are good, that are quick, and do it with the minimum amount of fuss.
Yeah.
And that's hard work, and that's what the task of management is. So that's the first thing to do.
Yeah.
The second thing, I think, is to have measures that work. The sector's full of people with good intentions, which is great,
Yeah.
but there's also some super examples of really effective non-profits, and they often get lost in the crowd. So what we need to be able to do is to say, here are the ones that are really working,
Yeah.
bring those forward and invest behind them. Then we say, how do we invest? And there's the fun part, because it's always difficult to get investment capital for the third sector.
But this is tough. I mean,
Yeah.
the Centre for Social Impact brought out a research paper just a couple of months ago on managing the downturn. And as you say, it shows that corporates and individual donors are having to tighten their belts right now and placing pressures on not-for-profit organisations. But it's also clear that there are underlying structural challenges in non-profit organisations anyway on taking this path to emerging as social enterprises. And the big one I see is access to money. There's a very ineffective capital market right now for non-profit organisations.
Exactly. It's very hard to raise capital for non-profits, which means that right now, more than any other time, everyone needs to go right back to basics and do everything right. So the first thing is to not be ashamed to ask for money. The biggest people do not give to charity is because nobody asks. So take a team effort to that. That means have a mission statement that any member of staff can say to their mates in the pub, this is who I work for and here's what we do.
Yeah.
And people can think, that's super.
So even if they don't remember exact words, they will be able to say in 30 seconds why they're committed to this organisation, why it really turns them on. Yeah.
That's right. And therefore people think, okay, maybe they're not asking me for money now, but if they ever were to, I'd put a few coppers in the tin.
Yeah.
Or whatever donation people can make. Engage the whole management team. Let the chief executive have the time to meet with people who can invest. And in particular, get the board engaged.
Yeah.
Because the board often has all the connections and understanding to find where the resources are. And if it can work as a team, can often release lots of potential capital that's out there.
Yeah. It seems to me that, of course, those boards are very important in non-profit organisations. They often get people in from the private sector to lend support, but often I suspect don't use them very effectively in terms of driving the organisation or driving its managerial and organisational capacity.
That's right. There's actually a fair bit of misunderstanding on both sides of the fence.
Yeah.
Some people in the non-profit sector look at the business people on the board and scratch their heads and say, these people have left their brains in at the door. And some of the business people come into the sector and say, no, everything here is crazy.
Yeah.
And the issue is lack of understanding. For example, accounts in the non-profit sector are very different from accounts in the for-profit sector.
Yeah.
So people from outside tend to get absorbed by overhead ratios.
Yeah.
Now, this is a quite pernicious thing to worry about because overhead is all the capacity for growth. It's training, it's investment, it's hiring the right people. And yet, outsiders often say, we don't want to help you with that. We just want to help you with the program. And they quote lots of statistics. Often, they're quite false. But what we need to do is to help people understand if we're investing for growth, we need to hire the right people, develop the right people. That looks like overhead, but that really is the ability to expand the impact that we want to have. And so what we need to do is to get people who are bilingual, business people who understand the sector, and sector people who understand the business people, so that on the board they can work very effectively together to say, here's where the money is, here's what it needs to be, and here's how we can get it from where it is to where it needs to be.
It seems to me, John, this is quite tricky because, you know, when you were involved in making contact lenses, it was relatively easy
That's
to
right.
judge how effective you were. You
Yeah.
knew you were producing contact lenses, you knew how much it cost to produce and market them, you had good measures of profit and shareholder value. But you take an organisation which has got a mission to do social benefit or environmental benefit,
That's right.
to provide accommodation to the homeless, or to provide welfare services, or to look after our heritage. It must be much harder trying to measure that. So I come to you and say, look, I've got this great idea, I'd like you to make a donation, to invest in me, to loan me money. But presumably you're going to say, well, hang on, where's my return on that investment?
That's right. And I think that's why it's critical in the sector to have very clear measures or some clear goal for impact that everyone can get their heads around.
Okay.
Let me give you an example. I spent many years in San Francisco working for the Stop AIDS Project.
Yep.
And it has an organization with great goals about preventing AIDS. But there was a very simple number that we used to worry about, which was the spread of HIV infections in the city of San Francisco.
Right.
There was a measure of it. It was fairly rough. And most scientists would say, well, it's not very accurate, but it moved up and down enough to understand what was going on.
Yep.
And it was very good to say to people inside the organization, this is what we're trying to do. So will this spending of money, will this team of volunteers, will this time help that or not?
Yeah. And that's interesting because it's a genuine outcome rather than just saying, how many people do we see?
That's right.
And measuring that, which I suspect is what many not-for-profit organisations presently do.
They do, yeah. But I think moving to an outcome makes it both more motivating for the people.
Yeah, because you know how it's linked to your mission.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's much more easy to go to the government and say, give us some public money, because we're really making a difference to society. And also it helps innovation, because if people in the front line know what they're trying to do, good people exchange good ideas.
Given, though, that resources are always scarce. I mean, the one thing I know about a not-for-profit organisation is that if there's any good, its ambition always outstrips its resources.
That's right.
And looking beyond this present economic downturn, I mean, presumably there are still going to be these challenges. So you're saying, well, go out, be willing to ask for money, presumably be willing to say it's an investment. Is there anything else you can do? I mean, other than obviously using your resources as effectively as you can?
I think going to investors and persuading investors to think not as donors, but as investors is a critical step forward. And obviously this results in huge benefits for the community, but it's a big change that's being asked of the donors too. Let me try and frame that one. Anybody who gives to charity feels good, and it is a good thing. You should do. You're supporting a good cause, you're probably helping a friend. The trouble is often we don't know what result it has. That's the point you're making. If we can say to people, here's the result you're having, here's the change that you're driving, it's more exciting. And if you're a big investor, a big philanthropic investor, you might actually have an influence in the world that could change the world. Concrete example, Mike Milken came out of prison with some money, but no longer allowed to work in the security industry. A young man, I say that because I'm older than he was at the time, but he was in the early 40s. And his doctor said to him, you don't have much longer to go because you have very advanced prostate cancer.
Helps to focus the mind.
It did. And he focused his mind and his money on helping to find a cure. He still survived, but he has driven research which has dramatically reduced the death rate from prostate cancer. If you look at the survivor rates from different cancers, prostate cancer is one that's actually improved the most. And that's because of his focused work. He's driven a change in the world. He's contributed to making the world a better place. The bad news is doing that is also risky, because you might fail. If you give money here, you're not giving money over there. People money over there will say, well, we have a good cause too. It takes time. It takes patience. But that's where the exciting parts of the sector are.
We've talked, John, about this movement from charity to philanthropy onto social investment. But what does this actually look like?
I'll give you a good example. There's a foundation in the United States called the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation that has led a movement to investing in the capacity of the sector to grow. So not just investing in programs, but the capacity of the organization to deliver those very same programs. Clark is the foundation that was founded on the fortune from Avon calling. It has about $1 billion, and they grant about $30 to $40 million a year. It's a lot of money, but there are bigger ones. And some years ago, they moved away from distributing money broadly to focusing on youth services in the United States. And then they focused down on the organizations that deliver that which meant that they started to give unrestricted grants. Rather than saying every penny has to be on this particular kid or that kid, they said, we'll give you the money to grow your organisation, to invest in the people, to invest in the capacity.
This is pretty bold, because one of the difficulties you have with philanthropists very often is they almost don't want any money spent on administration. So here you have this foundation out of Avon who are saying, look, we want to actually invest, genuinely invest in your organisational capacity. Is that right?
Absolutely. And they gave the money unrestricted, said we'll trust you to spend it, but we want you to grow. This is why we're giving it to you. And it's a bit like looking at an airline and saying, I only want to pay the fare for the fuel, but I don't want to pay anything for the maintenance of the aircraft.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be a pretty dangerous place to go to. And they've said we very much want to pay for the maintenance, for the upkeep of the organisations. In more recent years, what they've concluded is that that investment in organisations requires even further focus onto fewer organisations so they can grow them over a long period of time and get them to scale. An example of a story there is they've invested in an organisation called Nurse Family Partnership, which is a super program in the United States, came out of the University of Colorado. What they found was that by putting a nurse with a teenage girl who was pregnant for the first time and about to have a baby, that nurse could help the teenage mum have the baby safely, go to hospital when she needed to, and the nurse stays with the teenage mum for 2 years after the baby's born. Now, because they've done it for so long, because they were a university, because they tracked the results, what they found was that it helped the health of the baby, it helped the health of the mother, even to the point of mothers smoking less during those first 2 years. But if you track the course of those kids were much less likely to become early parents themselves, much less likely to drop out of school early, and much less likely to get in trouble with the police. So that early care really had a big, big difference. Great program, clear results. The problem is it costs a fortune. And what Clark did, which was very bold, was to say, not only will we help you grow, and we'll give you the money to do that, but we're going to get our friends to help you too. So they syndicated, if you like. They put together a team of other philanthropists to invest $43 million in 1 year. It's a commitment over a number of years to be spent to grow the organisation so it can deliver the kind of benefits it can do to a much wider number of people. It's a very bold move that they made.
But it's such a good story as well, because you've got there a social innovation that has essentially come out of the not-for-profit field, who goes and then gets corporate support in order to be able to invest in them to scale it up.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Now, we've only got a few minutes left, Jon.
Yeah.
So if you were talking to Australian non-profit organisations that are starting to move down this path and to see themselves as social enterprises running businesses for social purpose, what would be your key messages? What would be, you think, the key things that they should be looking to address?
Okay, I think first of all, get the right people on board. Make sure you've got a team that can drive the organisation where it needs to go to. Secondly, have a very, very, very clear measure of what you're trying to get to.
Right.
And that's not just a good mission statement, but also a measure where you can say, if the news reports in 10 years' time that something in Australia is much, much better than it was a decade ago, and you feel really good about that, and feel that we actually made a big difference, what was it you did?
Yeah.
Right? And then the third thing I would say, don't be afraid to ask for money.
Now, Jon, when we started, I talked a little bit about your background in management and leadership in the private sector, and your now great enthusiasm for working in the social economy. Yeah. But I would have to say you're probably the only visitor we've had to the Australian School of Business who has actually taught business education in a prison.
That's
now,
right.
You've got to tell us, how did this come about?
Well, it started a long time back. When I was a student at university in England, there was a program where you could spend a week on a camp with 6 prisoners who'd been given a week out as a reward for good behaviour. So 6 students went on a camp with 6 convicts.
Your reward is go camping with Jon Huggett.
That was it, yes. And it was me and 5 others from the university. And then the second half of the program was that we then went back into the prison for a week. So for a week in 1977, I had a cell, I had a number, and I did prison work and worked with all the other guys. And what that left me with was a strong sense was that prisons were colleges of crime. There were lots of really good guys in there, and they spent all their time thinking about how to do better crimes later. And they kept testing me, and were very disappointed about how bad I was. They said, you're at university, we dropped a school of 15, how can you not
You didn't have
get
that
this?
criminal entrepreneurship.
I needed to get better, clearly. So some years later, when I was living in South Africa, I went to a presentation by an organisation called Kulisa, which has a series of programs in prisons that work with convicts in prison to help change their attitudes, stays with them outside prison, and what it's managed to do is to reduce amongst those folks they work with the recidivism rate. That's the rate of reoffending. So classically, in South African prisons, around about 80% of people who get out of prison reoffend. Of the Kulisa grads, around about 20% do. So it's not perfect, but it's a super difference. So they invited me to go into prison to see some of their programs, and I was intrigued, having sort of been in a prison some, was that 25 years before. I was intrigued by the extent to which the guys were of the similar stamp, bright but undereducated, very sharp and entrepreneurial. And one of them asked me if I could help him with his business plan when he came out of prison. So I thought, well, if it's through the program, yes, but I wouldn't want to do this on the side. He had asked me what car I was driving, and I said I had a BMW. He said, well, you must be a good businessman. So I said, well. Anyway, so they then called me. He was actually a much better entrepreneur or leader than I think I'd given him credit for, because he then persuaded the other guys this would be a good thing to have a class on writing a business plan.
Right.
They then went to Kulisa, who then gave me a call. So I had this call from them which said, would I be prepared to teach a class on writing a business plan in prison? So I said yes, and put the phone down and wondered, what have I just done? So I said, let's put it together and assume that these guys are like the ones I work with back in the UK, bright, entrepreneurial, but somewhat undereducated, but very interested in doing things differently. And so I taught a very basic class in strategy. I was really impressed by the first class. Everyone turned up, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, pencils all sharpened. And so we said, look, the next class will be writing your own business plan, but this time we're going to talk about the work that you have done, the businesses that you do know, and we're going to analyze those to give you the tools so you can write your own business plan later. And so I went around the class and asked them, what kind of businesses do you know? So somebody said, I've sold groceries by the side of the road, so I wrote that up on the whiteboard. Somebody else said that they'd sold cars. I wrote that on the whiteboard and everyone was laughing. So I said, did you buy them or did you steal them or sell them? He said, yes. So we wrote that up too. And then I asked after this long list was completed which business the class would like to analyze. So they said, let's analyze the car stealing business. So we did a strategic analysis of it. And it was a very, very thoughtful set of people who understood all the dynamics of business. Raised a whole bunch of thoughts in my mind about how to think about customer segmentation, but also risk. This was a bunch of guys who, when I asked them the biggest cost, and I was thinking it was going to be tools, they were saying, you might get shot. And we had a very good discussion of risk and return, how these guys in prison had reconsidered their lives and why they now wanted to take fewer risks. And when we got onto the real businesses they wanted to build, some of them were tremendous. There was one guy at the back of the class who'd been quite quiet, and I asked him about his business. This is sometime later. And he said, well, in my township, there's no bookshops, and I want to open a bookshop. So we go, okay. He said, there's 640,000 people. There are no bookshops. Everybody has to buy books for school. To get books for school, they have to take a taxi into town. That's expensive. If I can sell the books in the township, I'll deliver a service and make lots of money too. And all of a sudden, everyone was looking at him thinking, you're right.
Yes.
So it was a very, very rewarding experience for me to see that. And then the happy ending is that a number of them got out. One of them tried to set up a business, had a couple of failures. I stayed with him, did very well. And then he got hired by a bank, and he's now a manager for a bank in South Africa. It's a wonderful turnaround.
It is a great story.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful way to finish the interview. I hope we can do as well with our MBA students. I'm Peter Shergold from the Centre for Social Impact, and I have been delighted to be interviewing our visitor from the United States, Jon Huggett.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thanks.
Great to be here. Thank you.